Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So if you have been following this series, you will have discovered in part 1 the perfect time to do your writing session. In part 2, how to use caffeine safely to energize yourself. And in part 3, a very simple method to make sure that you're always motivated when you write. In part 4, we are finally getting into the weeds and we will talk about what exactly to do at the start of each writing session. Do we just immediately dive in and start writing? What if we have a mental block? Fortunately, there's a very memorable 3-step routine that you can add to the start of each writing session to warm up your writing chops and make sure that you're ready to go. And that is to reread, rewrite, and resume. First off, we'll start with step 1, which is rereading what you last wrote in the previous writing session. The main benefit of rereading is that you are framing your mind to get in line with where you were last at when you stopped writing. It helps you refresh yourself with the details of the story, such as the nuances, tone, and mood, or the quirks of your character, and even certain details in the environment and setting. This gets your juices flowing and makes you excited to continue fleshing out your world and developing your characters, moving them forward in the plot. Additionally, it's not a very high effort task, so it's very easy to start and you won't feel like you need to immediately sit down and crank out 1,000 words in the first hour. Instead, you slowly guide yourself to a state where ideas and words are forming naturally in your mind so that writing them out becomes effortless. One thing to keep in mind though is that you would want to turn off your inner perfectionistic critic when you are doing this. You should read with the mind to make your writing just marginally better, rather than with the intention to tear yourself apart or completely revamp what you wrote. If you are too critical at this stage, you'll end up getting stuck here. So unless there's a real huge problem with the plot, turn off that self-critic while you are rereading what you last wrote in the previous session. So what do other authors say about rereading before actually writing? I have 3 authors here with their own personal opinions. Let's have a look at Marjorie Bain. She believes that writers should reread and rewrite as they go. However, she acknowledges that it's a very contradictory piece of advice. And why exactly? So let's have a look at the next 2 authors, Haley and JP. And both of them agree that actually you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't be rereading your work while writing. And the reason that they give is because it can sometimes leave you feeling too bruised to keep going, right? And sometimes if you keep on rereading, you never finish anything ever. So remember my earlier point about the inner self-critic? You would have to turn it off before you begin this step of the routine. I'd like to emphasize that even Haley and JP actually qualify their statements by saying that they do reread at least some part of their prior writings at times, simply to get into the flow of their work. So I believe that so long as you can stem your perfectionistic, critical tendencies, there's absolutely nothing wrong with rereading what you wrote, and in fact, it can be very helpful for getting you into the right headspace for continuing your work. On the flip side, we have Mercedes R. Lackey, a very accomplished sci-fi and fantasy author of over 140 published works. She recommends both rereading and editing what you wrote the day before. So as you can see over here in her Reddit reply to the question. Once again, I emphasize the importance of rereading with the persona of a constructive critic who's trying to genuinely improve the writing by some marginal amount rather than comparing against some unreachable standard. This would actually help with step 2, rewriting, which is up next. Rewriting is the second step to take before we actually resume writing any new section of work. And the reason is because grammatical errors tend to be easier to spot and correct at the start of the session rather than at the end when we are already tired and worn out. Even more importantly, we might be able to spot big mistakes with the plot or even character inconsistencies, things that might take our readers out of the immersive experience. By catching these problems early, we can avoid compounding on this mistake down the road, making sure that our writing session is set up to be a really good one. While rereading what we wrote in the previous section, we might also experience a spurt of inspiration. As inspiration strikes us, we can add more details and flourish during this step of the routine. And finally, since it's not as heavy as a completely new page, the rewriting process can be thought of as a warm-up to the actual writing session, letting us slowly ease back into it. What do other authors say about the rewriting process? On the left, we have Ryan J. Pelton explaining why we should edit as we go. It keeps our motivation high as you don't feel like you need to eventually go back and edit a whole ton. Also, the little details are still fresh in your head, so it's not too difficult to edit without feeling like you're completely losing the plot. And more importantly, it helps you make major changes in your work early on rather than too far down the line. I mean, how many times have you felt like the story is going off the rails? If only you were able to catch it much earlier on, you could have saved it. Now, editing as you write is also something that a lot of professional writers do. So we have one of these professional writers, their opinions on the right side here. And that's Lee Chow, a very popular thriller novelist. And he calls this process churning or combing. That's because he goes back before every writing session to reread what he wrote and then comb through it, churning out a better version of the original before continuing the next section of writing. He confesses that this is his actual go-to method of priming before he starts writing. The next step after we're done rewriting or editing is to resume. We can finally start writing our story again. Now that we are in a good frame of mind and able to recall where we left off, hopefully having fixed any major errors before continuing, we are now in the perfect condition to resume writing the story. It shouldn't be too hard since we have already warmed up in the previous steps. As a final note, there's this very popular quote from George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series. He thinks that there are two kinds of writers, the gardener or the architect. The gardener lets details and direction develop organically. They kind of know the seed that they planted, whether it's a fantasy story or a mystery story, but they don't know the exact plant that will spring out, how many branches it will have, whether it's a flowering plant, and so forth. They find out as they go along. As for the architect, they enjoy planning everything down to the finest detail. They know how the story is going to end, how the characters are going to develop, and so on and so forth. Now, we are usually a mix of the two. But if you find yourself being more of a gardener than an architect, you want to follow the 3 steps as I've lined out here. After rereading and rewriting, you can resume writing immediately. Now, if you are more of an architect than a gardener, then you need to have one more step. Review before resuming. That's because you don't want to forget the important details that you need to add into your story to keep it on track and according to your genius plan. So for those of you who followed along slide by slide until here, I really appreciate your attention. And you should give yourselves a pat on the back for sustaining your attention for this long. Some of you might have skipped to this section to save time. Well, congratulations, I have exactly what you want here. The key points that you'll need to remember for part 4 of my writing routine is as follows. If you do ever get lost, remember to reread what you wrote in the previous section, rewrite or edit it, and then finally resume writing your story. This is better than just jumping straight in and forcing yourself to write. Starting in the middle of nowhere is just an easy way to write with a lot of mistakes and very little inspiration. Your readers will not be thanking you for that. As a side note, if you have a plan for where your plot should be going, remember to review it before resuming. It sounds obvious, but it's an easy step to skip, especially when you are in the flow of things. Nobody likes to stop their writing, go back to check their plan before continuing. However, following this routine should make your writing a lot smoother and more enjoyable. With this video, I've come to the end of my series, which highlights the routine I use to write 2,000 words a day. First, you need to know your power hour, then how to use caffeine safely to energize yourself. Incorporate breathing and exercise to prime your writing session. And finally, follow this simple reread, rewrite, resume 3-step method to get started. Practice this routine every time you're planning your writing session, and maybe you'll even surpass 2,000 words a day. I hope you found this series very useful to your writing. Do give me a like and a subscribe if you like more of such content, and I'll see you around in the next video.